let's talk some about tubing. So, Joel, the first few minutes of that video, we saw a tubing system there. We saw a variety of colors and options and things to see. Can you just talk a little bit about what those types of tubings are and what they're used for?
Yeah, so in your tubing system, obviously you have different sizes of tubing and different kinds of tubing that all play different roles. Generally, you have a large line or a wet dry line coming into your releaser. Back from that, you have a main line. Back from the main line, you have a lateral, and then coming into the lateral, you have a drop line. Not every producer using vacuum tubing necessarily has a wet dry system. Some of them have single main lines coming right to the releaser. But as Kevin mentioned, there's different sizes of tubing with different purposes. Our main line is what brings the sap either to the releaser or to the wet dry system that brings it home. Then the lateral lines go from tree to tree, bring it into the main line. And our drop line is what brings it out of the tree down into the lateral line. Kevin also mentioned different colors of tubing. So our tubing is generally semi-color coded. Blue has been the standard for a long time, and we still see a lot of blue tubing, especially laterals and main lines. But we're beginning to see different colored tubings used for drops, especially. There's a number of reasons to be doing this. One of them has to do with when we change drop lines. So we recommend changing drop lines every 3 years if you're using non-check valve spouts, and every 5 years if you're using check valve spouts. But when you change that drop line, when you're changing and it's a different color, you can see what has been done and what hasn't been done, and also what year you changed drop lines. So if you're a producer that maybe has, that you want to change 500 drop lines 1 year, 500 the next year, and 500 the year after that, if you're using a different color every time, you can know what you did which year. It's very easy to know what got done, what didn't get done, and when it got done. So it just allows you to, a quick visual recognition. The other thing I really like about having the different color drop lines from what all the rest of the tubing is, when you look across the woods, you can kind of see this kind of maze of blue if you're using all blue tubing. Whereas like myself, I use yellow drop line. So if a drop line happens to be popped off the tree, it's a little bit more noticeable because it's a different color that's kind of hanging in that maze of blue. Whereas if all the drop lines are up and on the tap, you can kind of see that and it stands out a little bit more. So different color drop lines are definitely becoming popular, and for good reason. We offer multiple colors of drop line material in our flex tubing along with our pre-cut drops. So we have that available to purchase if you're looking to change drop lines and start switching out some colors.
Yeah, thank you, Joel. And some terms, if you're not familiar with tubing overall, terms to kind of consider. A drop line is directly what drops from the spout to the starting point of that lateral line in that system. A lateral line is a 5/16 or 3/16 roll of tubing that actually connects multiple trees together. From there, it connects to a single main line. That main line, without vacuum, you're generally going to have that's going to be the carrier of your sap there in the woods. And then if you hook it up to vacuum, Joel mentioned wet, dry. Without getting a lot into that, basically it's to deliver vacuum and transfer sap at the same time throughout the whole woods. So those are some terms that we hear looking at tubing as a whole. But there were some other things we saw in that video as well. That David showed a releaser, and I don't know if we showed the vacuum pump at all, but can you explain, David, what that's for, what options that we have, and how to maximize that?
So one of the most difficult things for the small producer is vacuum. Right up front, without pulling any punches, vacuum of almost any kind is going to increase your sap volume by 2.5 to 3%, or 2.5 to 3 times per tap. Okay, so vacuum makes you a lot more efficient in terms of the amount of sap you get out of the woods. Now, if you've only got 100 taps on a hedgerow someplace, vacuum gets really, really tough. If you've got a steep slope, you can get really good vacuum with 3/16 like Deanie Aldrich does, and that helps increase your production. If you're looking at a tubing system similar to Jarrett's, you should be going into a vacuum pump. We have them sized from 500 to 800 taps all the way up to 10,000 taps. So you can choose oil-cooled vacuum pumps. People sometimes say that's old technology, but let me tell you, when something breaks out in the field and you can fix it pretty easily, that old technology is pretty valuable. And we have larger vacuum pumps, which are more energy efficient, in the bush pump, which run off of VFD. Releasers, your choice is whether you want a mechanical releaser or an electric releaser. The one you saw in the video is actually an electric releaser, where it uses an electric deep well pump inside the vacuum cavity to pump the sap out of the releaser. High vacuum, if you're going to go vacuum, high vacuum is the way to go. We spend a lot of time. I answer a lot of questions every single year to people who say their vacuum pump is not working. Your vacuum pump is probably working fine, and what you have is leaks on the woods. And if I have to come out and help prove that to you and help you find them, I will. One of the biggest differences in the way we design tubing systems today, as opposed to when I first started hanging pipeline back in the 70s, we try and maximize the distribution of vacuum. Vacuum at your vacuum pump is nice to see. Vacuum at your releaser can be a point of pride, but reality is the vacuum doesn't do you any good until you get it into the tree. So if you're not distributing the vacuum correctly throughout your tubing system, you're not getting a maximum production. You can spend what you want to spend. The wet dry line that Joel mentioned, typically that's in a larger operation or an operation where the taps are some distance from the vacuum pump. The longest distance I have in the woods that I've designed over the years, from the vacuum pump to the first tap, is a little over 2 miles. So that's a big wet dry line system. That's a big one. Remember, the goal is to get the vacuum to the tree.
Yeah, thank you, David. And David spoke earlier about sap flow as a whole. When you're looking at considering and trying to gauge what your success is in the woods, you average your sap flow over a 5-year period. With gravity systems or with buckets, your average is probably going to be somewhere in that 8 to 12 gallons of sap per tap. That's pretty realistic. When you look at, and again, David mentioned sap flow and the gain, as you add a vacuum pump and you start getting over 25 inches of sap, it pretty much runs in line with the amount of vacuum that you have to the amount of gallons of sap that you have in the woods per tree. So, if you're at 25 inches, you're going to be in that average of about 25 inches or 25 gallons of sap per tap. So some woods will run more, but for the most part, your success is in sap production. Your sugar might change, so your syrup production might change as well, but that's a good average. So when he talks about doubling the sap, it is literally doubling the sap in the woods with a vacuum system. So we did have a question here, and you recommend changing drop lines 3 years or 5 years with check valves. How often do you recommend changing lateral lines and also main lines? Joel.
So I'll preface this with saying all of our tubing will last for 20 years in the woods. I'm not saying I want to keep it in those for 20 years, but it will last for 20 plus years in the woods. We use a chemical in the tubing to help it so that the UV light from the sun doesn't break it down. It all has enough of that chemical in the tubing so that it will last for at least 20 years in the woods. That being said, I personally, in my own operation, after 10 years of the lateral lines being in the woods, I'm going to tear all the lateral lines out of the woods, and that's for 2 reasons. By that point, the lateral lines will have been fixed and worked on a lot because of the leaks that get developed from branches and chews and all this kind of stuff. And the other thing is, our woods are an active place and they're always constantly growing and changing and they need management. So in 10 years, I want to head into the woods and do a nice light select cut and take out some of the trees that have been damaged, maybe the trees that are dying, some not maple species trees at that point, and also thin out around some of the nice maple trees that are coming through. We need to keep our woods so that we have a very broad range of trees in there. If all of your trees are the nice big old trees, that's great for a while, but when they all die, you have nothing. So you need to be actively managing that woods to keep that broad range. So that's more the reason that I'm going to be tearing my laterals out in 10 years is so that I can come in and manage that woods and log and do what I need to do. And that being said, The lateral or the main lines, they should be good for 20 years. There may be things I want to change in 10 years, so I won't say that we won't change anything out, but I plan on leaving all the main lines in place when we tear all the lateral lines out. And I see that becoming more common with a lot of the producers I work with. They see a lot of value in being able to take all the laterals out of the woods and replace everything at that point. It gives them a chance to just start from new again. You know, that first year is always really nice because you're not chasing leaks down, and everything's just nice and tight and nice and clean. So it gives you just kind of a fresh start again and change all the laterals out in that 10 years. But if you've done a good job maintaining your system and you're not seeing lots of leaks and you don't need to do a lot of management with cutting in that woods, you can go much longer than that. You can go 20 years. I've got producers that have been using 30P tubing for north of 20 years and guys that have 20-year-old 30P tubing in the woods, and it's still in decent shape yet. It's somewhat faded, of course, from the sun over time, but it's still in good shape. So you can definitely keep the tubing in the woods for 20 years if you haven't struggled with damage, and it's going to be just fine. But you just need to be cognizant of at what point do you keep fixing on something or just replace it. So it's not a solid answer. It just depends on kind of how things have worked in your woods and what management you need to do in the meantime.
Sure. Thank you, Joel. And you know, thinking about, you know, those timelines, you know, one of the things to consider is how many times have I fixed those lines? You know, if you take a main line that's had a bunch of trees kind of fall on you, you know, Mother Nature waits until we put lines in the woods and then everything blows over on top of it. So, you know, if you fix those lines a lot, you know, you have to consider whether or not it's worth it, because every time you put a repair somewhere, it's going to affect vacuum and CFM delivery. So it certainly is important to think about, you know, what shape is that line in 15 or 20 years, because it may not last 20 years just because of that reason overall. But again, thank you for the question. David, you started with some information about leak control in the woods there from that video. Can you talk about not only checking for leaks, but, you know, the culprit in the woods and what we look for, and then the releaser, all encompassing leak control? Can you just describe what you were talking about?
So one of the things I like to say to all my customers is you don't make any money in the sugar house. I don't care how fancy your sugar house is. I don't care how fancy your equipment is. I don't care how fast you are, how good you are, how much you produce. You do not make money in the sugar house. The only way you're going to make money is to get the sap out of the trees. So in a perfect situation, whether you're medium vacuum or high vacuum, you're out there walking those lines all the time. All the time. Every single day sap's running. Some days when sap's not running, you're out there walking in the woods looking for lines that have come apart, looking for where bullwinkle ran through the woods and stretched some lines out, looking for a place where, in some sugar places I've been in, where a bear came out early and chewed the heck out of a main line because he was hungry. Leaks happen every day from various different things. Sometimes just a small branch falling down out of a tree will hit a tubing line, a 5/16 tubing line just right, and pop a drop line off a spout. That's a vacuum leak. That's lost sap. If you're losing sap, you're losing money. A lot of my producers, I'm able to teach this. Some people can't understand it. Some people can. Where I showed in the video that the way the sap was coming into the releaser, that works with an electric releaser or a mechanical releaser. Pay attention to that. If the sap is coming in a nice gentle arc and it's not violent at all, then on that main line or in that wet dry line system, you probably don't have leaks that you have to go look at. But if the sap is shooting right straight across that releaser, right straight across that manifold in the back of the releaser and smashing into the other side, it's a pretty good chance you got a strong leak on that main line or that system. That's the place where you should identify to start your vacuum leak detection. Then it's shoe leather. Then it's snowshoe time. Then it's go up there, walk the wet dry line system if you've got a wet dry line system, or walk the main lines if you're all main lines. Try and find what tubing line leaks. Try and determine what the leak is and fix it. In leak detection in the woods, that loop I showed you in my hand with the meniscus of sap between the sap and the air moving, if sap's running that day, you're looking for leaks, and those air bubbles are shooting really, really, really fast in that in that loop, that's your leak. One of the places or that's where there is a leak. One of the places that I see where people fail in leak detection, if there's no liquid in that line, if SAP's running and there's no liquid in that loop, it doesn't mean that tubing line is okay. It means that tubing line has a bad leak and you're not getting SAP in that line. And as you walk up that tubing line from tree to tree, you'll probably find a spot where a woodpecker has drilled it, a squirrel has chewed on it, mouse has squirreled on it. You know, we have all kinds of critters out there that like to chew on tubing. They've created a vacuum leak, which is preventing the liquid from above there coming down in that tubing line. It's that simple. And even if you're on a gravity system, I'm going to tell you guys, even if you're on a gravity system, SAP that's running on the ground doesn't pay you. So you need to be walking those lines.
Sure. Thank you, David. And, you know, all of us, you know, the key, like David said, is to maximize that woods. Money's made in the woods. That's where it starts. You know, you only can boil what you have for SAP. So, you know, for those that are looking to grow and looking to expand, and if you potentially have a large wood that's difficult to get to, or you have multiple woods, we do have an opportunity to be able to get to that woods and see that woods without necessarily being there, and to streamline and maximize that process. So Joel, you want to talk about SmarTek and what you've been able to do around the country?
So yeah, we partnered with H2O Innovation last year to be able to offer their SmarTek system available to our customers through us. So we can sell you that SmarTek system and get it installed in your woods to help with your woods management. The SmarTek has been a great tool to every producer who is using it. I've set systems up pretty much all over the country at this point, and everybody who has it loves it. It's a super easy to install system, and it's very, very user friendly and very easy to use. And it allows you to see truly what's going on in your woods or multiple woods. The ideal way to put a vacuum monitoring system in is to have the ability to monitor every main line for vacuum level. Then you can see what the vacuum is at your releaser and what it is at all the main lines. And then you know if you've got a main line that's running lower than what it should be, you know, that differential is greater than, say, 5 inches of vacuum between your releaser and the end of the main line. You know, there's going to be a leak somewhere on that main line and you want to go chase that down. However, you don't have to set the whole SmarTek system up at once. You can start with maybe a few sensors in the woods and tank level monitor. And then from there, keep adding on. The system is completely expandable. All you need is more sensors, keep adding them in the woods, and you can expand that system over time to cover the whole system. Or if you add on to the system or bring a second system into play, you can just, you know, keep adding nodes and the system will all talk back to each other. It's very, very advantageous also for producers who have multiple sugar bushes spaced out. So there's a lot of people, myself included, who have a sugar bush that's a ways away from their sugar house. I have to travel 10 miles to get to the sugar bush. During the season, I have to make 3, 4, 5 trips there a day. I'm constantly checking on things. So having that SmarTek system is a really nice peace of mind to know my vacuum pump is running, my tank's not running over. I can just pull up my phone, look on my tablet or my laptop and see, hey, look, SAP tank's at, you know, 50% and I've got 28 inches of vacuum everywhere in the woods. We're good to go. Whereas maybe and you can set it up to send alerts also. So if mainline 3 has a low vacuum, you can set it up to send you a text message. You can also set up to text you when your tank gets to a certain point, so your tank's not running over. A lot of producers have really, really liked that feature because I have a producer in specific that this year, he said his phone got him up in the middle of the night a couple of times. They didn't expect SAP to run overnight, but his phone went off at 2:30 in the morning saying, hey, you've got SAP in the woods that's about to run over. So he got out of bed and was able to, you know, not lose SAP. Whereas he figured that those vacuum or the tank level monitors paid for themselves in the season very easily just by the SAP they didn't run over in the woods because it ran overnight and they didn't expect it to. So it offers a producer a lot of ability to know what's going on in the woods when you're not there, and also tell you what's going on in the woods if something happens when you're not there.
Yeah, thank you, Joel. And, you know, vacuum monitoring is certainly a feature that I believe we're going to see a lot more as people expand their woods. You know, looking at a woods as a whole, you know, one of the things to remember is if you don't know what you're doing or you're not comfortable, we love this. That's what we do, so organizing and setting up those woods, we're here to help. You know, again, looking at what is the biggest effects in your woods that cause your success, or in this case, potentially low yields. High vacuum is really as simple as it gets. Maintaining a woods at high vacuum is one of the pillars of making sure that woods is highly successful. I would say another key pillar overall is the system must drain. I spend a lot of time in the woods all over, and it may feel like your woods is draining, but if you have main lines that kind of do this in the woods, or the system is loose, or in this case, maybe you have a flatter woods, getting and understanding pitch in the woods really does matter, because it does need to drain. If it does not drain out of the main lines, if it doesn't drain out of the wet dry in a collection point, it's not going to be high yields year after year. So certainly something to consider. We do have a question here, and I just want to talk a little bit about cleaning. So this person asked, if you are keeping them up for 10 years, how do you clean them? We flush them with hot water, and is not to add anything that would flavor the sap in the lines, but hot water doesn't clean all the black buildup. David, can you talk about cleaning lines?
First thing I want to say about cleaning lines is if you are putting anything in your lines, any product whatsoever, make sure it's food grade. Okay, we have real problems with people using non-food grade stuff to try and kill all the bacteria in their lines. There are products which are actually illegal to use here in the state of Vermont or in New England, and I believe out in the Midwest as well. I personally don't clean tubing lines. Or let me rephrase that. I clean my tubing lines every year the first time they fill up and freeze, and the ice takes all the crud out. I find that, and quite a lot of us here in the Northeast find that simply by opening the lines up and letting them drain this time of year, letting them dry out, that you don't get a large amount of growth. You're going to get some. I don't care what you do, you're going to get some. Being a producer of tubing, where we make our own tubing, I would like to tell everybody to make sure and use some product to clean that squirrels and wildlife really like, so they chew up your tubing, so you have to buy more. Reality is, if you want to flush that tubing with fresh water, that's fine. Try and make sure that water drains, because that water, whether it's hot or cold, that water stays as a growing medium until it completely evaporates. So you may actually grow more in your tubing system by putting water in it than you would if you didn't. There are the guy I want to work for, I haven't heard about him in a couple of years, but the guy I really want to work for when I retire is a guy up in Canada that flushes all his tubing lines with raw vodka. We hear it all. The majority of my customers simply pull their taps. If they're using stubbies, they just let them hang. If they're using seasonal spouts, they cut them off and let the drop line hang. Yes, you sometimes get some sort of spider or maybe a mud dauber or something like that goes in the end of the drop. Yes, coyote pups, bear cubs, fawns will chew on those hanging drops, and you're going to lose a small percentage of them. But basically, if your system is allowed to be open, it seems that the tubing system and the mainline system will dry out just from natural evaporation, and doesn't really seem to grow as much stuff as it does if you feed it with water.
Oh, thank you, David. And I do want to add to that as well. I think that one thing to consider when you're thinking about washing lines is, and if you calculate some of the numbers in loss or any yield gain, you're going to find that there's nothing that you can use to flush those lines with. They're going to give you a gain in yield, and it's going to cost you time and potentially money to do that. So the keys to cleaning, like David mentioned, as far as looking at what to flush with, leaving those lines dry and spending all of your energy and time with newer materials with less bacteria. Things like check valves really make a difference in the woods. and that's check valve spouts by long-term use and maximizing yields every year. So we had a question about this person asked, we've got a 300, we have about 300 taps with a small diaphragm pump and a flat ground, 1% slope. And this person asked if there's anything they can do with sap lifts to increase yield. Joel, you want to answer that? You deal with a lot of flat woods as well out there out west.
So thank you, Kevin. As Kevin mentioned, we deal with flatwoods. We're not blessed with the mountains that you guys have in Vermont. We deal with a ton of flat woods. Not everywhere is flat in Wisconsin, but it seems to be a lot of the state is. So to answer your question, sap lifts are definitely necessary in some systems, but if you're using a diaphragm pump and specific for your vacuum pump, a sap lift is not recommended at all because of the amount of air your pump is capable of moving. Any sort of sap star lifter, the ladders where it's got the star and multiple 5/16 lines, or the canister lifters where it introduces air to suck sap up a mainline type line, those all require air to push that sap up. You need a vacuum differential where you've got high vacuum on top and low vacuum on the bottom, and you need that sap to go up. And you need air admittance to get that sap to go up. Whereas if you're using a diaphragm pump, you're not moving very much air with your diaphragm pump. So now when you start introducing air to make a sap lift work, you generally lose vacuum in the whole woods very, very, very fast. If you'd have a traditional style vacuum pump, on the other hand, you can have some sap lifts to help bring sap up from low points. That being said, if you can have a system at 1% is minimal slope on a main line, that's really less than what a person should have. But if your main line is a short, well-maintained main line that's draining well now at 1% slope, adding a lift and repitching the line is not going to gain you any sap at all. Just you're end up lifting sap that doesn't need to be lifted to get that sap back out of the end of the main line. That being said, if you're having troubles with the main line draining, there's difficult spots in your woods, maybe a lift to get the sap up at that point might be something to look at. But if it's draining now, I probably wouldn't adjust on it a ton. But 1% slope is the bare minimum. There's just no room for air, even at 2% slope. I've got a significant portion of my woods that's at 2% slope, and there at 2% slope, there's no room for air where you have the wire and the tubing hanging on the wire. If that tubing crawls up the wire any little bit, or any sort of a sag whatsoever, you've lost all slope you have, and now that sap's got to flow uphill. So low slope is possible, but it definitely requires more maintenance and more care in setting the tubing up. One thing that I found that helps a ton with low slope woods in specific is using multiple 12.5 gauge wires. We generally on an 1.5-inch line will have 3 12.5 gauge wires, and on a 1-inch line we'll use 2 12.5 gauge wires. That second and third wire provides a lot more rigidity to hold that tubing up where it needs to be to maintain slope. So that's something a person can do. It also offers you a bit of safety factor. If you have a mainline wire break and there's 2 more holding it, it at least won't fall down. I actually had one of my wires on a double wire line break this year, and we knew it right away because you could see that the line wasn't as tight, but not everything came crashing down, which is really nice. That double wire provides a little bit of security factor too. It's definitely worth something in the woods because we can't necessarily get to fix everything every day.
Yeah, sure, Joel. Thank you. And lifting sap in flat woods can be challenging, but again, we're here. We love this stuff. We also, one thing to remind everybody of that's on this call is that regardless of where you're from, as long as there's maple trees near it, for the most part, we have somebody. We have a strong dealer network, and there's certainly someone around the country that has information to help you get you through or get you started. So, just a reminder, overall, if you have questions at all, we're confident with our network. There's a lot of I'll use the term maple nerds out there that would be happy to help. So thank you for the question. That was great. There is a question here directly to David, and he asked about you just let the first run of the year on the ground to flush lines, correct, with a question mark?
Oh, heck no. Here in Vermont, when we find mice or squirrels in the sap buckets, we wring them out before we throw them away. So what I end up finding most of the time is nobody can really tap their woods out in a day, unless you're really small. So what you end up with is you don't turn your vacuum pumps on when you're tapping, and you take 2 or 3 days to tap, and eventually some of that stuff will wash out of the system. But what you find, most of it that comes out in the first part of the year, if you've let your system dry, most of it that comes out stays dry. It doesn't reabsorb. It doesn't seem to reabsorb and can be filtered out very easily with a pop-on filter. You know, I years ago, years and years ago, we used to wash with Clorox. I definitely do not recommend that. Please do not do it. But you know, that in the 70s and 80s, that was all the rage. And back then, we definitely let a lot of sap run on the ground before we would gather it. Now, where I don't introduce anything into my system, as soon as there's enough taps to be worthwhile catching the sap, and it looks like I can gather up enough sap to actually start my operation, I close the valves on the tank and we start catching sap.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question. There was another question here about the back vacuum with extra permeate this person does in pulling piles. And again, you're free to do that if you want to, if that's the way you want to clean. Just to go back to what David had said, you know, water generally isn't the liquid that we want to have stay in those lines over summer into the next season. So it doesn't totally drain out, especially in 5/16 or 3/16 lines. So certainly something to consider there while you're looking at the next year. So again, thank you for that question. There is another one here, and Joel, question is, we do have to get the sap up to about 2 feet to get in the tank. Would we be better pushing sap after the pump versus lifting it into the pump?
So I'm under the impression that this is the same person that asked about the 1% slope with the diaphragm pump. And if you are using a diaphragm pump for your vacuum pump, you can use the pump to push sap. That's one of the nice things about those diaphragm pumps, or those little 12-volt RV pumps that people use. You can use that pump to push the sap up to your tank. I mean, you're not going to be pushing it hundreds of feet or anything like that with the pump, but you know, if you need to pump it up 3 feet to get in your gathering tank, that is, it works, and it works just fine. Big thing to remember is you don't want that line freezing full of sap overnight, so that has to be managed. But you can use that pump to push the sap up. That is definitely the recommended way of doing it. Also, when you lift sap up with the pump, so if your main line comes down at its nice slope and it's got to curve up to get into the pump, you're going to lose vacuum by having that curve up, and that's going to freeze full every night. Whereas if the pump is down low and then the pump pushes it up, you can manage that freezing up with some insulation, and you're not going to be losing vacuum at that point.
Hey, Joel, on your diaphragm pumps out there, have you ever seen a 5/16 loop to keep liquid in your pump?
Yep. So that's something else that a lot of producers have to do. So if you're using a diaphragm pump, a lot of producers end up having a loop where they're sucking it back out of the tank and through the pump. The reason that is on the pumps, if you're keeping the diaphragm wet all the time, it does two things. A, it helps lubricate the diaphragm, and it does keep the diaphragm lasting longer. You know, the pumps are built that they can run dry, but if they run dry for very long periods of time, they wear. Other thing is, by having liquid in that pump, it allows that diaphragm to have a perfect seal. Every time that little bit of liquid helps seal the diaphragm perfectly, and you'll achieve much higher vacuum. A lot of producers talk that they can maybe get 12, 13, 14 inches of vacuum with a dry diaphragm. As soon as you add moisture to that and cause that diaphragm to be wet from either sap flow or a recirculation line, the diaphragm pumps are capable of achieving 20 plus inches of vacuum. So, you know, having the recirculation line is definitely something that a lot of producers do. I'm not a large expert on diaphragm pumps in specific because I don't use one. That's generally a lot of smaller producers, but a lot of people do, and they work well for somebody, you know, maybe with 50 or 100 taps.
So basically the difference is, guys, so you understand, there's two ways to create vacuum in the woods. The way most of us do it, the way the bigger operators do it with our vacuum pumps, is we actually create vacuum by pulling air. The vacuum pump actually moves air. With a diaphragm pump, or with 3/16 tubing, both of those create vacuum by pulling liquid. Okay, so by putting that recirculation loop in ahead of the diaphragm pump, you keep liquid in the pump, you can achieve much higher vacuum. that may help overcome that low slope.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. No, that's great. The one thing again to remember with vacuum is we don't have the numbers here today. We generally can span out for hours in tubing, but the economics generally are, if you can get to the highest vacuum potential, your woods pays itself off faster. So if you're from the hobbyist level all the way up to a major producer overall, maximizing the vacuum in your woods will pay off quickly. Anyway, so I don't see any more questions here overall, but again, if we get off the call here and you have questions or you think about something, I just wanted to ask that last question, or I'm not sure totally what they meant. There is a share in here on the chat with the website, and if you want to schedule a time with us, feel free. We'll just go through any questions that you have